Okay, it is, according to my watch, it is 10:06. So I think we'll start with whoever has already arrived to be with us this morning. So let me say good morning. Good morning to everyone. I absolutely cannot believe that we're already at the end of January. But yeah, here we are. So maybe formal introductions first. My name's Ferial Domingo. I'm the acting executive director for Imiatello. We're obviously delighted to welcome all of you. Those of you who have already made it to be with us. I suspect there will be a few still joining as the morning proceeds. We know people have very busy lives, and while you have every intention to want to participate in something as important as this, often, your diary doesn't allow it when it actually comes to the day that you want to be part of this. So again, very good morning. Good morning to our esteemed colleagues, our researchers who are on the call with us today, and of course, our civil society partners and friends and civil society members of the family of that we are so close to, who are joining us. When I last checked the registration, there were people joining from all over the globe, and so we're delighted. I do hope that we see them here present this morning. It is really my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. This is the official launch for the latest research on mitigating the unintended consequences of the Financial Action Task Force, and in short, FATF, recommendations for the NPO sector in South Africa. I've just read what is there on the screen. That's the research paper, which has been formulated into a publication which will be accessible to you immediately after the launch. And I would encourage you already at this point to please look out for it, find it, have a read through it, as I think it is a very important piece of research that we've done up until today. So why are we meeting today? Perhaps if Suzanne can move the screen over to the official welcome page, then I can talk to on that page. We are meeting at this very critical juncture while the Financial Action Task Force standards are designed, of course, as we all know, to protect the integrity of the global financial system. We have seen, many of us have seen, how the misapplication of recommendation 8 can lead to overcompliance in a sense, which results in bank de-risking, the shrinking of civic space, which is a very big concern for all of us, and the undue targeting of non-profit organizations, which our researchers will talk to later on this morning. Today's session is not just about identifying these challenges or raising it with you. It is also about evidence-based solutions potentially. The research we are launching today provides a very comprehensive analysis of how we can balance security requirements with the vital, I would think, life-saving work of the nonprofit sector. I think we must all agree to that. I mean, our work is life-saving. And so on the agenda today, what we have on the next slide, my partner is fingers is moving a bit slowly. Sorry, Suzanne. So you'll see that's the agenda that you would have received in the invitation. There was a link to the agenda. I just want to read out that to you. That is the flow of the morning over the next 2 hours. We'll be talking to the survey methodology and findings. There will be the three researchers right up front there. We'll talk to that. Then there's the panel discussion convened by Glenn Farrett. And then we'll go into a little bit of a Q&A if there are still questions that doesn't happen to come up during these presentations. We will have a separate session for that towards the end, and then I will make some closing remarks. So on that note, because I think I'm very, very keen and excited to hear and listen to the presentations of our three researchers, and we'll go straight into that. Okay. Well, I'm told to tell you a little bit about Inyatelo. So for those of you who do not know Inyatelo, we're a nonprofit trust. We were established in 2002. Our main purpose is to strengthen the capacity to mobilize support and resources towards building sustainable and purposeful organizations. But for those of us who've been around for long, we know how critically important that is, and more important in today when we're facing all these challenges that is outside of our control to a large extent, right? We're all about advocating for the practice of advancement. A little bit more of that you can certainly read up on our website. So I don't want to spend too much time on that because I'm pretty sure many of us are familiar with the work of Inyatelo. And then just very briefly, these are the kinds of resources that you will have access to on our website, and you engage with us. There's various types of resources available to you towards strengthening your organization. On the next slide, then, a little bit about the research project, and maybe I should just highlight that before I introduce you to our esteemed researchers. Inyatelo is the convener of what is the non-profit, where are we just calling it, the NPO working group. We have been part of convening this group very closely for a couple of years now. It's amazing how time flies. I recall our first meeting about the subject at hand here. It was, I think, the 21st of October in 2021, already as early as that. And I mean, I can't believe it's almost, well, it's four years and a bit now. And so, of course, in 2024, when the GLAA, the General Laws Amendment Bill, was promulgated, and while we were involved in nonprofit sectoral risk assessments at the time, we submitted a funding proposal to the Ford Foundation for this piece of research. And at the time, we knew that the response needed was to be better informed. We needed to understand what NPOs were actually experiencing on the ground as a result of what was being introduced to the sector in terms of the GLAA amendments. We had very big concerns and call it suspicions, if you like, but very little concrete evidence of exactly how these challenges were in fact affecting NPOs. Now, we all know that there's about 500,000 nonprofits operating in the country, and only a fraction of that is in fact registered. And so it was important for us to cast our net for the research as wide as possible. Even that was a challenge, but the researchers will tell you. So towards the end of 2024, we contracted a team of researchers to help understand what exactly was happening and to inform our response as the impacts continue to unfold and impacts quite heavily on the nonprofit sector. So what you will hear today is some of what we have been able to discover through this research project, and we hope that you can engage with the researchers as and when you feel throughout this session today. It will be really good to hear your voices. And for those of you who want to, you can put your comments in the chat, and we will keep an eye on that and make sure that we address any of the concerns or any of the things you want us to respond to through that chat. So on the next slide then. So let me introduce you to the research team. As I said, I'm pretty excited to listen to what they are going to share with us. I did make a note so that I am doing this properly. I did make a note of the bios for the research team, and I think I should read it out to you. Just give me a moment while I find the notes on my table. So the research team, I'm so sorry for this, about the researchers. Give me one moment, please. Okay, so we've got it. There was a four-team research team, a four-person research team, and I will just read through the very brief bios so that we know who we have in the room. So we've got Advocate Gary Pienaar. He's a senior research specialist at the Human Sciences Research Council with a robust legal background and years of experience in governance and accountability. His work focuses on the intersection of public policy, human rights, and constitutional law. He is a prominent voice in analyzing the impact of regulatory frameworks on civil society and has published extensively on anti-corruption and legislative oversight. So thank you, Advocate Gary Pienaar. Next, we have Dr. Michael Kosse, who is a seasoned researcher with a distinguished career in the social sciences. His expertise spans a wide range of policy-related issues, including higher education, labor markets, and institutional development. Michael is known for his methodological approach to complex data. Dr. Kosse's recent work focuses on the societal impact of global regulatory standards, specifically how international mandates translate into local implementation challenges. Delighted to have had Dr. Michael Kosse with us on this research team. Then we have Dr. Maxwell Maseko. He is an accomplished researcher and academic with specialized knowledge in public policy and governance and the socio-economic effects of global financial regulations. Dr. Maseko is recognized for his ability to bridge the gap between high-level policy theory and the practical realities faced by organizations on the ground, particularly within the African context. Last but not least, and I'm afraid we didn't put up his photograph because you're going to see him very shortly, Glenn Farrett. He's a dedicated researcher and project manager with significant experience in the nonprofit and land rights sectors. He has served as a program manager at AFRA, the Association for Rural Advancement, where he focused on tenure, security, livelihoods, and the rights of farm dwellers and workers. His work often involves navigating complex regulatory environments and advocating for the protection of marginalized groups, making him a vital contributor to the study of how international standards like FATF recommendations 8 impact civil society operations on the ground. So with that, I'd like to welcome the research team, and I believe they have their own presentation. So I'll allow them to put their presentation on the screen. And thank you very much.
Good morning, Ferial, and good morning, colleagues in the research team, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Ferial, for the kind introduction. We should also mention that working very hard with us in the background was Ms. Chegovatsora Makela, who whose name appears on the report as a contributor, and we're very grateful to Glenn for his strategic guidance and insight. I will just, sorry, I just need to put this into presentation mode. I'm going to talk very, very briefly and then hand over to my colleague, Dr. Michael Kosser, to take us into the meat of the findings. But we just wanted to present to you the study aims and objectives as defined by Inyatelo for us. And they wanted to, as Ferial has explained, understand the activities of regulating authorities and other stakeholders in the context of implementation of the FATF recommendations, measuring the impact of these activities on NPOs in South Africa, to look at the trends within the regulatory environment in response to those recommendations, and then to enable Inyatelo to respond effectively on behalf of affected CSOs. And we do hope that this research assists them in doing so. The aims of the research were therefore to undertake research into the evolving regulatory environment. We recognize that the GLAA had been enacted, and as a result, regulatory authorities had started to take action in response to their revised legal mandates. And then we needed to look at the impact on civil society organizations thus far, and then also to establish a framework through this research that would enable Inyatelo to undertake future assessments, because this process is evolving all the time. And FATF's recommendations are adjusted and amended over time. The regulatory environment in South Africa is changing over time, and just recently a General Laws Amendment Bill was promulgated. So this is a further revision to the GLAA, and that was promulgated for public comment just recently, and we'll go into that a little bit later. And then obviously to contribute to Inyatelo's program of raising awareness amongst civil society in South Africa about this and other governance issues. We adopted a mixed methods approach, starting with a literature review and a legal impact assessment. The lit review focused on FATF and its key recommendations affecting the nonprofit sector. And then the legal impact assessment reviewed the impact on the sector of the FATF recommendations as expressed through the GLAA, and the changes to mandate and activities of the regulatory authorities. These were all foundational to the design of questionnaires that were posed to the various stakeholder groups in an online survey, in a series of focus group discussions, and also a set of key informant interviews. We had, I think, perhaps many of the people in this meeting and beyond who participated in an online survey of the nonprofit sector. We had 9 civil society focus groups, and we're grateful to Mr. Jimmy Gutiano, who's also present in this meeting, for helping to convene and conduct those 9 focus groups. We had 20 key informant interviews with various stakeholders, and all of these will be described in a little bit more detail later on. And then our draft report was discussed at a workshop with an independent reference group convened by Inyatelo, where we received feedback on the draft report and proceeded to make some revisions and prepare the final report, which we're presenting to you today. I will stop sharing and allow Michael to pick up and share his copy of the presentation and take us through his part of the findings and from the online survey. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Gary, and good morning to Ferial, the Inyotela team, and everybody on the call. I'm going to be speaking about the online survey which we fielded. It was a very long survey, and to those of you on the call who participated in it, we do apologize for the length, but we wanted to get as much information about the sector as we could over and above information about the impact of the FATF recommendations on the sector. So I'm going to try and share now my screen. Just give me a moment to get going. I hope you can all see that. I seem to be starting at the end. So I need to just go back to the beginning. Okay, so the online survey was conducted via the SurveyMonkey app between the 15th of April and the 4th of July last year. And a total of 147, just short of 148,000 email invitations derived from the DSD NPO database, and a small number derived from the Inyatelo database went out to non-profit organizations. The overall response was 5,490 organizations, 5.9%, which unfortunately is very low for any survey. The response rate, as you will know, depends on a number of factors: non-profit organization access to email, non-profit organization facility with completing online surveys, the extent to which the organization feels invested in the non-profit organization sector, two profits there, I'm not sure why, and the actual number of non-profit organizations in South Africa. Because this is now moving on to the key findings, because the total population of NPOs is unknown, the findings from the survey cannot be generalized to the whole population and are therefore indicative only. All the findings are disaggregated by organization type. And the fact that the total population is unknown means that findings pertaining to a particular organization type cannot be extrapolated to all organizations of that type. That just follows. The third finding is that there's a fair amount of ignorance within the nonprofit sector about its regulatory dispensation. For example, organizations not understanding what being registered means. Many organizations were found to be non-operational, chiefly because of a lack of funding to register, to maintain registration, or to continue operations. Notwithstanding the lack of information about sectoral size, by far the largest number of nonprofits operated in two sectors: social services, 1,700 for 39, nearly 40%, and education and research, about 23%. And these numerical advantages are reflected across all 5 organization types. More than a quarter of organizations, 29%, had adequate human capacity in only one of 6 specified areas: administration, ICT, finance, tax compliance, governance, and legal. while 37.5%, almost 2 in 5 organizations, had no capacity in any of the 6 areas. Again, notwithstanding the lack of information about sectoral size, the majority of non-profit organizations, 52%, were shown to comprise 1 to 5 staff members, which renders them, in terms of the South African SME definitions, micro-enterprises. And this perhaps explains the lack of human capacity mentioned in the previous point. Nearly 1 in 5 organizations, 18.4%, was found to be unbanked. 3/5 of organizations whose bank or other financial institution accounts were frozen or closed cited financial impecuniousness as the reason for this. And that's a measure of the financial stress many non-profit organizations are under. The freezing or closing of accounts was found to have palpably inconvenienced more than half of the organizations whose accounts had been frozen or closed. Almost a third of banked organizations did not know whether their account fees were higher than those for individuals or businesses, perhaps suggesting a fairly large measure of financial illiteracy among non-profit organizations. Excuse me. The financial institution of just under a third of organizations asked about their activities, while the financial institution of just over a third asked about the source of their funds. 58% of organizations had an accounting officer who was not the CEO. 67.8% produced annual financial statements. The financial statements of 71% were audited by an external auditor, and the financial statements of 69% were reviewed by an external accountant. Just under half of the organizations submitted annual financial statements to DSD only, 22% to DSD and SARS, 10.5% to SARS only, and nearly 7% to DSD and CIPC and SARS. And then smaller percentages submitted statements to CIPC and SARS, to CIPC only, and to DSD and CIPC, while negligible percentages of organizations submitted statements to other combinations of authorities. 60% of all organizations were registered with SARS as a taxpayer, but only half of registered voluntary associations were thus registered. 53% of organizations submitted tax returns to SARS, though it's not clear whether these were differentiated from annual financial statements. Only a quarter deducted and paid PAYE to SARS, and only 17% were registered as a VAT vendor. 2 out of 5 organizations had no written policies in place for any of the risks specified in the survey: corruption, cybercrime, human trafficking, money laundering, financing of proliferation and weapons of mass destruction, and terrorism. The ability of nearly a third of organizations to access funding had been reduced as a result of increased regulatory and reporting requirements, while such requirements had increased the administrative burden of nearly a quarter of organizations. Donations appear to play a small part in non-profit organizations' operations. Nearly 2/3 of organizations received no donations at all, while the next highest percentage, nearly 14%, only received donations of under 10,000 Rand. Individual donors were mostly known to the vast majority of organizations, 85%, rather than being anonymous. While for reasons discussed earlier, any findings about sector size cannot be generalized, half the non-profits declared they were neither fundraising nor grant-making organizations. The majority of fundraising organizations had set no limit for receipt of cash, travelers' checks, money orders, and virtual assets. Of those organizations that had set limits, around 90% had set a limit below 250,000 Rand for each of these money receipt types. The majority of fundraising organizations, 86%, had not received inflows from individuals or organizations based in foreign jurisdictions in the last fiscal year. 86 organizations, that's out of 3,621 who responded, or 2.4%, said they had been approached to launder money on behalf of an individual or organization, while 38 organizations, 1%, said they had been approached to raise, safeguard, or transfer money for terrorist activity. Importantly, however, excuse me, organizations were not asked whether they had agreed to launder money or process money for terrorist activity. And since the survey was anonymous, and since the vast majority of email addresses had a Gmail, Outlook, or Yahoo suffix, NPOs cannot in any event, for the most part, be identified. A total of 35 organizations, 25 of which were non-profit companies, had transacted with individuals or organizations based in one or more of the countries listed by the US as state-sponsored terrorist countries, Iran, North Korea, Syria. 31, 18 of which were non-profit companies, had transacted with organizations or members of organizations listed by the United Nations as terrorist organizations or terrorists, and 28, 15 of which were non-profit companies, had transacted with individuals classified as politically exposed persons. The nature of these transactions was, however, neither asked for nor disclosed. 28 organizations had been investigated by government on suspicion of money laundering, while 19 had been investigated by government on suspicion of terrorist financing. 19 organizations had been investigated by a bank or financial institution on suspicion of money laundering, while 17 had been investigated on suspicion of terrorist financing. The largest number of respondents, 43%, had never reviewed their records for signs of suspicious activity. A majority of organizations, 88%, had not been informed by government of the country's potential grey listing before it happened, while 95%, 96%, had not been informed by government of the country's actual grey listing. 88% of respondents had received no advice or guidance from government on how to reduce the potential risk of terrorist financing. 86% of respondents were unaware of any terrorist financing risk assessment having been undertaken by the state. A quarter of respondents were aware of FATF. 77% knew either nothing or a little about what FATF did, while only 4.5% had a lot or a great deal of knowledge about FATF's work. However, 44% of respondents were aware of Recommendation 8, FATF Recommendation 8. More than half of the organizations, 56%, had either not implemented Recommendation 8 at all, or had done so only to a small extent, fewer than 1 in 5 having implemented the recommendation to a large or very large extent. Respondents may not have made the connection between FATF and recommendation 8 when they answered these questions. That's one possible reason for the discrepancy, but that's just speculation on my part. And that's the end of my section. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Maxwell Maseka, to continue with his part of the presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, colleagues. Thanks, Michael. I'm going to ask that you allow me to share, Michael, please, and share.
I think, unshared. Can you see if you can share?
Okay, let me try. Let's see. All right, that should be fine. If you can bear with me just for a moment, colleagues. Can everybody see what I've just shared?
Maxwell,
All
it's
right.
it's just I can see just half the image
Just
of
half
your
the
screen.
image.
Yeah.
I wonder why that
So
is so.
you might need to enlarge, make it full
Perhaps
screen.
just put the presentation in presentation mode, and then it should take up the screen.
Okay, I'm trying
You see
to.
if you've got the presentation mode, because at the moment it's just in the normal slides.
I wonder why that is so, because I can see the entire thing on my side. Well,
Unless you're sharing the wrong screen. So you're sharing
yeah.
the screen with the speaker view, and you should be sharing the presenter view or the presentation. See if you can maybe unshare this page and then
Okay, let me
reshare it
unshare this
again.
page.
Maxwell, would you
Yeah.
like us to share for you?
Yeah, please do that. Please
All
do
right,
that.
we'll do that. No problem.
Yeah,
There we go.
that will help
Okay,
a
There we
lot.
go.
Thanks.
All right.
But I also now just need to get out of the screen on my laptop. Let me stop the share on my side.
There we go.
Is it fine now?
Yes, that worked. Thanks,
Yes, that's
Maxwell.
good. Yes.
Okay. But I think the challenge now for me. Okay.
Just give us a second quickly, Maxwell.
All right.
Sorry, everyone. Shark, are you able to share the presentation? It's just been sent to you via email. I'm also
Oh,
struggling.
buddy, I'll have to go out and then come back in again. I'm
I
not
can-
running this from my
Okay,
system.
it's fine. Then
I
you
can
start it up.
do it. I can do it.
Ah, there we go.
Thanks, Gary.
And while they're sorting out the tech, I want to say thank you for your patience. This is not normally how things go, but you do have your off days now and again. So thank you for your patience, everyone. Please don't go anywhere.
All right. Thank you then, colleagues. I'm going to be speaking on the focus group discussion that we held as part of the study. The focus group discussions were held in various locations around the country. And we went to the country's 9 provinces between May and June 2025. In our discussions, we involved deliberately selected representatives from the nonprofit sector and other stakeholders. How did we choose these organizations? They were chosen because They are part of the Alliance of NPO Networks, which is an umbrella organization and apex body that represents the NPO sector in South Africa. We encourage participants to engage in interactive conversations, responding to structured questions that we had set down for them, and openly sharing their personal experiences and concerns. The focus groups basically aimed to identify and analyze trends, as well as to understand and evaluate the activities of the NPO sector. And, we also got ideas from other experts within the regulatory frameworks in response to the FATF recommendations. So generally, we applied the principle of anonymity in our focus group discussions. I'm going to ask Gary that you move on to the next slide, please. So
Can you
as
see
you
that,
will,
Maxim?
yeah, can see that.
Okay,
Thank you so
great.
much. As you will then see in the main study, colleagues, we've got a table there that sort of spells out the key areas that we identified as themes in the various provinces around the country. It's going to be table 79, or table 42, yes, if I recall in the study. And according to the data then on the table, which we tried to simplify as much as possible, we were able to identify dominant themes in each of the 9 provinces about the key priority areas for NPOs. The themes are as follows. We grouped each of the provinces according to common challenges that we found in each of the provinces and the priority areas for NPOs. And then we also made a section for solutions. However, I'm going to urge everyone to read these challenges or these various themes, as in totality, just to get a good picture of what is happening in the country. But also one of the reasons for splitting them in provinces is also to ensure that some of these organizations get the help that they need. Once things are broken down, then it's going to be easy to see what the needs of each provinces are. So according to the themes, there was a common thread across the sector on the lack of capacity and support for NPOs nationwide. We also were able to pick up unfavorable banking systems and a lack of public awareness programs about FATF regulations. What then were the challenges that we picked up? Participants in focus groups shared many of the same challenges faced by NPOs in South Africa, including limited capacity to comply with financial regulations on money laundering and terrorist financing. They called for increased funding from the Department of Social Development to strengthen their NPO capabilities and also suggested creating a database of financial experts to assist NPOs, particularly those smaller organizations in rural areas, to comply with general financial laws governing the sector. This also included giving them access to specialized auditing skills. There were also concerns that were raised about new legal requirements that could impose additional burdens on smaller NPOs, which often struggle to manage these demands due to their limited resources. We're also able to pick up through participants' frustration over insufficient laws addressing financial crimes and the complications arising from the existence of multiple databases for monitoring NPOs around the country. Nevertheless, there's a widespread belief that both the government and banks have a responsibility to ensure the safe transfer of money, both internationally and domestically. Amongst the banking issues that were discussed, this included risks of account deactivation for inactivity of accounts and regulatory pressures from bodies like SARS and banks that could lead to deregistration of some of these organizations. The need for civil society collaboration to negotiate better terms was also emphasized by participants. Awareness of FATF recommendations we found was low due to insufficient government support. Participants requested a central repository for compliance information, and they also voiced concerns about inadequate funding for compliance management. Additionally, they also noted capacity constraints in the NPO sector regarding technology use in rural areas, and they criticized banking regulations that they then say discourage formal banking for low-income organizations. If you could move on to the next slide on solutions, please, Gary. Then overall, the section on solutions, participants propose that government and the private sector should collaborate on public awareness programs about FATF regulations and enhance governance and risk management for NPOs. There were key recommendations that were made, which include providing training for NPO staff, fostering advocacy and collaboration amongst stakeholders, creating a single authority for NPOs, and addressing high banking fees, especially for those NPOs that operate in rural areas. Community awareness initiatives were also raised as some of the recommendations. They want to see more of those. And there was an appeal for streamlined registration processes and educational efforts by the DSD, which were deemed as essential. There was also an appeal to reduce compliance burdens, conducting regular risk assessment and supporting training and banking staff, supporting training for banking staff, which was also deemed to be important. Participants also called for increased NPO engagement with FATF recommendations. They called for more community workshops and dialogues on regulations to ensure that there's community participation and support for the nonprofit sector. And this related particularly in high-risk areas where smaller sort of NPOs operate. I think that, that was the crux of what came out from our focus group discussions. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Maxwell. I'll now just proceed to the next part of the presentation on the key informant interviews and the key findings emerging from that. And I see that in the meeting today, many of the people who we interviewed, as well as people who whose work we've referred to in the literature review, are present. And thank you all very much for the insights and expertise that you shared. So the first question that we asked was whether South Africa's response to the grey listing by FATF had been effective. Understandably, there were mixed assessments of the effectiveness. Some view government's response as symbolic, with inadequate dissemination of essential information to the NPO sector, as emerged from the focus groups, while others see the necessity of legislative changes, as well as seeing improvements in implementation and coordination. So we see there's some unevenness in perceptions about the extent to which there has been effective communication throughout this process across the sector. Then the General Laws Amendment Act and beneficial ownership registries, the establishment of those are viewed as significant steps, but implementation capacity is said to remain a challenge. So the fact that these have been established in law, the establishment as well in practice of beneficial ownership registries are important, but people don't really know how to navigate those. And sometimes it's the regulator and sometimes it's the organization that expressed the concern. The diversity of the non-profit sector's risk profile was emphasized, with it generally being considered as medium to low, but also evolving. So because it's a dynamic profile, the risk profile needs nuanced and balanced regulation. It needs monitoring as well. And there was significant concern expressed about potential or sometimes actual overreach. The importance, therefore, of continuous risk assessments and engagement to to understand the profile of the risk, and who is involved in the risk was emphasized. And engagement between the various stakeholders was also therefore important. We asked then whether legislative amendments that have been adopted in South Africa align with FATF best practice, which is risk-based and focused, etc. There was broad agreement that FATF's risk-based principles are appropriate, but there were concerns raised about over-regulation and associated administrative burdens, especially for smaller and informal NPOs. So there was concern that really, although a very small subsection of NPOs really do present some kind of risk, everybody is required to register in the same way, report in the same way, and be treated in the same way. For example, by banks, by the regulators, and so on. Legislative measures such as the BO registers do enhance transparency and the tracking of individuals who control NPOs, such as board members. So that was seen as a positive. But there were implementation challenges, again, coming back to resource constraints, but among both regulators. Again, some regulators more than others, and within the non-profit sector. And then also weak prosecutorial capacity also impacts effectiveness negatively. So this is a reflection of what came out in the focus groups, that there was inadequate legal frameworks in this area. While the legal frameworks on paper might be appropriate, the criminal justice system capacity is where it was felt that the greatest measure of ineffectiveness was evident. There is debate over whether the regulations are truly risk-based or more rule-based. So this really goes to the issue of whether or not there is a clearly defined differentiation of risk profiles among the NPOs, the different types of NPOs, registered or unregistered, for example, or non-profit companies, or just NPOs registered with DSD, and a call for a clearer identification of actual risk within individual NPOs. So this goes to whether or not there is sufficiently nuanced approach, which is what the FATF best practice calls for. The application of the FATF-defined NPO approach was also queried with informants or interviewees. There was a general acceptance of the FATF parameters being appropriate, but respondents indicated there were challenges in interpretation and practical compliance, and particularly regarding cross-border activities. And this, again, echoes what came out from the focus groups, where it was felt that banks have the primary responsibility and the resources to monitor and regulate and manage cross-border financial flows, and there should be a more nuanced approach to this, and this will come out a little bit later in a bit more detail. There remains some confusion about overlapping regulations for organizations that are registered with DSD and those that are registered with the CIPC. Many respondents called for clearer, more contextual application of FATF standards suitable for South Africa, which is a developing country with a diverse non-profit sector, which includes a very large informal component. Whereas there is the law suggests a very, to a large extent, a blanket approach to NPOs, regardless of their capacity, regardless of their actual risk posed. There was broad recognition, including among regulators, that most NPOs face a low risk of exposure to money laundering and terror financing, but widespread governance weaknesses and informality within organizations in the sector make some especially vulnerable to abuse. So we saw in the online survey that many organizations don't have great levels of financial literacy. They don't know how to check for risks. They don't know where to look. They don't monitor their own financial activity and the use of their bank accounts, and they don't really know how to identify whether or not they're being exposed to risk. So there's a need for ongoing risk assessment and improved governance standards, I beg your pardon, within NPOs to adapt to the changing threats. More detail of that to follow. The intended impacts of regulatory changes. Most respondents regard the objectives of being to improve internal governance and accountability and transparency in the sector. So that's what most respondents believe are the objectives of the legal and regulatory changes, which they support. Several respondents identified also enhanced data reliability and interagency collaboration among regulators. The traceability of board members was viewed by several respondents, possibly even most, as an important positive step towards accountability of those who manage NPOs. And some respondents identified dual objectives of the regulatory changes as being to address the country's FATF evaluation deficiencies and to extend the reach of the ability to ensure anti-money laundering and counter-terror financing efforts. The gaps identified by respondents in the regulatory framework included coordination and information sharing among regulators, which has improved but remains incomplete. So, for example, there are still different sets of data, different data points requested by regulators. Regulators don't really know what other regulators are doing entirely. There is improved information sharing and coordination, but there is a way to go down this road yet. Limited resources among different regulators. So different regulators are differently resourced, hamper implementation, enforcement, and compliance across the sector. This could be more complementary, whereas at the moment, perhaps there is an element of overlap. Some respondents indicated that an option missing from the framework is support for self-regulation as a risk mitigation strategy, and several respondents referred to the lessons we could draw from Kenya in this regard. And there's more detail of that in the report. There was a widespread debate about conceptual justification for and the relevance of NPO-focused regulation, with some respondents pointing out that the evidence base for a focus on the sector is still outstanding. In other words, we haven't really got to grips with the evidence base in the sector of what the risk profile is. And there was really, when the risk profile of medium was established, it was based on really quite a limited sample. And we don't really have, as a country, a full understanding of the full spectrum of the sector. Of course, it's difficult with many NPOs being unregistered, but even among those registered, there is a limited understanding of the risk profile. And in any event, the risks have moved since the risk assessment was undertaken, and it's shifted from organizations to individuals and cryptocurrencies. So we can see from this feedback from respondents that the nature of the risk, the location of the risk, the people or the entities that should be focused on are not really bank accounts and NPOs, but individuals and cryptocurrencies. So I think that was an important finding to highlight. Several respondents expressed concerns that the broader public sector governance and corruption issues undermine the effectiveness of anti-money laundering and counter-terror financing efforts. So there's in other words, those broader governance concerns in the public sector and issues or concerns about corruption give rise to concerns about whether or not there's really an ability in the public sector and in all regulators equally to implement these particular AML and CTF measures. Challenges and unintended consequences. There are 2 slides on this. Public awareness and outreach was one. Many small and rural NPOs remain unaware. We've seen that from the survey and from the online survey and the focus groups, unaware of the new regulatory requirements and the reporting requirements. And much of this comes down to the digital divide, because when we spoke to regulators, they said they've undertaken extensive outreach measures and public awareness measures. But when we spoke to organizations drawn from the rural areas or peri-urban areas, and they're not necessarily always online, they were perhaps unreached, they said, and they hadn't been aware of these opportunities to engage and these opportunities to learn about what was happening. And so it seems as though there's a reliance by regulators on online engagement and insufficient effort to reach those who are not on the right side of the digital divide. Several non-profit sector representatives called for in-person outreach as a result, in the form of roadshows, for example, and then for those who are online, a central information hub. So a one-stop shop. Where do I find out what I am? What am I? Am I an unregistered voluntary association? Am I an NPO? Am I a non-profit company? Some, of course, may know already, but there was a call for a central information hub so that people could see, oh, these are alternative options for what I could be registered as, for example, or the structure that my organization could take, a trust, for example, and what would that entail, so that people in non-profit organizations could think about the options available to them in an informed way. Regulators, not all, but some, tended to emphasize a great deal of sector responsibility, but acknowledged that there is a need for government-led education. And obviously this would be the different forms of regulators taking responsibility for that education, and particularly for those kind of in-person roadshows. The administrative burden, the other part of the major gap. Fragmented regulatory requirements continue to cause confusion and give rise to duplication. So people didn't know, and increased workload. So people didn't know to what extent they should be reporting to the NPO directorate and or other regulators, for example. And people didn't know how much and what information they needed to report and in what format to which regulatory authority. And so there was increased workloads, perhaps sometimes unnecessarily, in order to try to meet the standards. And if those of different regulatory bodies, if they understood and if there was a clear understanding that an NPO needed to report A and A plus to different regulatory authorities, or just A to different regulatory authorities, it might ease the regulatory burden. Beneficial ownership reporting requirements are sometimes misapplied, it was reported, with banks rather than regulators driving this requirement. So it seemed as if banks found this beneficial ownership requirement and register more useful and more important, and they were using it more often and on a more regular basis to de-risk their activities and their operations, whereas some of the regulators were relying on the banks to do this, and just thereby accepting that this had been undertaken by the banks. So there was sometimes a misunderstanding, it seemed, reported from some of the respondents on the part of NPOs, whether they had if they had reported their information, their beneficial ownership registration information to, for example, the CIPC or to the Master's Office, then was that information automatically available to other regulators, or did they need to report it again to a particular regulator? And so that information gap created a possibly unnecessary additional administrative burden. Regulators noted that there had been improvements in interagency coordination and collaboration, while some NPO sector reps welcomed the move towards increased digitization of records and online systems as facilitating the simplification of reporting obligations. Others cautioned that this did not benefit less well-resourced NPOs, for example, those that had still found themselves on the wrong side of the digital divide. There may be a significant distinction between the well-established large NPOs and the smaller, rural, sometimes temporary or unregistered NPOs that potentially pose a higher risk for money laundering and terrorist financing. And this might be particularly because they are off regulators' radars. They fly below the radar, and particularly if they're unbanked, they don't fall into the regulatory scope of the banks. And so there's the potential of abuse there, and among those organizations that are not registered at all. And the establishment of this latter type of NPO may be encouraged or even driven or incentivized by avoidance of the administrative burden of compliance with the new regulatory regime. So this might be the burden of reporting, or it might be the result of banks de-risking and closing bank accounts. And so the de-risking and closing of bank accounts might cause more NPOs to fall off the radar. And the most common basic denominator for an NPO to be on at least somebody's radar was if they have a bank account. But if they're de-risked because of lack of use of their bank account, then not even that element of their activities can be identified. Foreign founders and directors was a third component. Documentation requirements associated with these compliance requirements have discouraged foreign board members' participation and donations from their network. So it was reported by key informants who have some of whom have a broad vision across the sector, said that they've seen foreign board members just withdrawing from involvement in South African NPOs boards. And so South African NPOs are losing out on the governance standards and the networking and the funding that comes with the involvement of foreign board members. The certification processes for foreign board members are burdensome, costly, and very time-consuming. We can go into that detail later if necessary. And also it was identified that some organizations' structure is being distorted because of these requirements. So, for example, some NPOs need to report or adopt a particular form if they have members or if they don't have members. And so they will artificially boost their number of members because it eliminates the requirement for certain reporting requirements. So the balance in an organization between the board and members might be lost because of organizational distortions, because there's an artificial incentive to increase their number of members. And those members might be dormant or artificial or members in name only. They're not informed members, they're not active members, who therefore don't actually play a role in the organization's governance at all. The risk of regulatory overreach, there was a risk of overburdening. Some of the regulations are weakly nuanced across different NPO sizes and profiles, and therefore this may suppress legitimate activities in the sector. There was a need for more targeted risk-based oversight, focusing on high-risk NPOs while minimizing burdens on low-risk NPOs. And again, harking back to one of the earlier findings, focusing on the new risks that are emerging, and that is the focus on individuals and on cryptocurrencies rather than focusing on bank transactions. There were concerns expressed about the conflicts of interest involved in the DSD's dual role as funder to some NPOs and as regulator for many NPOs, and the implications for its ability to effectively regulate in a nuanced and focused way, in a targeted way, in accordance with FATF guidance and principles. The response by nonprofits, much fear and confusion about stricter regulations, may lead to NPOs withdrawing from registration or allowing their registration to lapse or avoiding registration altogether, thereby increasing MLTF risks. Registration incentives, it was said, would be widely preferred over broader mandatory regulations. So there was a suggestion that there should be an incentivization for registration rather than this mandatory regulation approach, which was seen as an enforcement or a compliance-driven approach, rather incentivize rather than enforce compliance. Regulators reported, however, no evidence of significant number of deregistrations by NPOs due to new registrations. And those deregistrations that did occur following the new registrations were linked to non-compliance. And it was just a lack of understanding or the ability to comply in time, because many of those NPOs that were deregistered were subsequently re-registered after they met the compliance requirements. So you can see different pictures emerging from different stakeholders that we interviewed. Problems with multiple databases. This creates inefficiencies and duplications and confusion. There was broad support for either a single integrated database or a set of interoperable databases, with divergent views on which oversight agency should host an integrated database if that was the route that was going to be followed. It was felt that a set of interoperable databases might be easier and simpler because each agency or regulatory body has its own requirements, and it might be simpler if they could each just look at each other's databases and find information that they might need and populate their databases rather than having a single integrated database, because many of these bodies at the moment have different mandates, of course, and they require therefore different information. And it might be difficult to establish different user interfaces that allowed what might be very confidential or sensitive information to be exposed to different kinds of NPOs as they look at this database and either look for their own information or update their own information or report. So on balance, there's a preference for data sharing and triangulation among regulators over full centralization, because the latter is seen as legally challenging and technically complex. The fragmentation and capacity of regulators, I know we're running behind time, so I'm trying to rush. I do apologize. I'm aware of the need to speed up. The fragmented regulatory landscape, because of varying mandates and capacity, creates challenges for the sector. Respondents proposed improvements, including one or more of the following: either stronger self-regulation or clear incentives for NPO registration, and improved capacity among both regulators and nonprofits. So a broad set of needs identified. And then it was indicated that trust in effective systems and reliable results on those systems is essential for encouraging information sharing and compliance by NPOs. We spoke to some NPOs during the course of these key informant interviews where they said, look, we've just allowed some registrations to lapse because there's no value in it for us. And so we've pursued and maintained registration with one regulator because that's where our interests lie. They are more efficient and effective, and it's in our own interests and to our own benefit to ensure that we remain compliant with their requirements. And so The other regulators, we've perhaps just allowed our registration to lapse because that regulator really adds no value. So that particular organization, for example, that organization type sees no benefit, and that they've come to that realization themselves. Others have yet to come to that realization, and therefore they feel that there is a duplicative or triplicative compliance requirement with the NPO Directorate, with the CIPC, and with SARS, and with banks. And so they feel this is just simply overwhelming, and they withdraw and perhaps become unregistered voluntary associations, or they focus just on one regulator. Relationships with government, widely shared perception of a lack of genuine consultation by government with the sector as a whole. Obviously, from what we've said already, what we've presented to you, is that this has been uneven. If you are an NPO and you're online and you're tapped into membership networks, or if you're offline and you are also tapped into membership networks, such as those that we were able to reach through Jimmy Gochana, there was a sense that organizations that have a stake in the sector and realize the value of collaboration, partnership, and information sharing, and staying plugged in with others, they have been exposed to more information. But there was a weak partnership between government and the nonprofit sector in other sets of organizations that might fall outside of these umbrella organizations, or these coordinating bodies, and those remain unreached. And it was felt that those ought to be reached by government, reaching out in person. And it was felt that therefore there needs to be a stronger presence on the ground, for example, by DSD and maybe even the NDA, the National Development Agency. We'll come to that a bit later. But there was recognition that there has been increased attention from government after the regulatory changes, but trust issues persist, and trust is uneven at the moment. Corruption, perceptions of corruption and actual corruption in the public sector undermines these AML-CTF efforts, while ethical leadership in all sectors, including in the NPO sectors, and across different kinds of organization was highlighted as a key enabling factor. So high levels of self-governance, good governance internal to NPOs, ethical leaders who recognize the public benefit, the benefit in the sector was recognized by everybody as important. The relationship with the banking sector was really an issue of major concern. And banks' alleged practices of overzealous and misguided de-risking was repeatedly expressed. So if a bank account is regarded as underused or dormant, they are closed by the banks. Some individuals in the focus groups said they were closed without notice or contact, and that might be because emails, for example, are not always working, and because of poor connectivity in rural areas, whereas banks claim that they always follow the code of conduct for banks, which requires prior notification of closure and some kind of engagement to avoid closure. But there seems to be a practice that if bank accounts are not used for a period of about 3 months or more, then they are closed. This might de-risk the bank, but it enhances the risk potentially for the country, because as indicated earlier, if an organization has a bank account, that's probably the only thing that a regulator can monitor for any signs of money laundering or terrorist-related activity. And it removes from the regulator's radar any possibility of some kind of monitoring or oversight. And so there might be a sense in which banks' understandable wish to ensure that they pose as little risk as possible actually exposes the country's profile to enhanced risk by pushing people out of out of the banking sector and therefore into the unknown, into the unregulated, into the unmonitored. So participants among all stakeholder groups called for better communication between banks and the non-profit sector and improved understanding by banks of NPOs' experiences and needs. So this particularly relates to NPOs' experiences of not having regular finances very often, and they live from grant to grant or donation to donation, and they don't therefore always have money in their accounts. And sometimes they might need a zero-fee bank account, which we found some banks do offer, but many NPOs didn't seem to be aware of, for example. And there were concerns expressed, therefore, over the effect of financial exclusion on NPOs, which limits the ability for AML-CTF monitoring. The responsibilities of regulators, all stakeholders emphasize the value of and need for collaborative multi-stakeholder approaches. Stakeholders also support financial inclusion being prioritized to avoid excluding legitimate NPOs and the support for effective oversight of AML-CTF. Stakeholders also emphasize the need to balance security with an enabling environment for legitimate and socially vital NPO operations that meet desperately needed needs for desperately needed operations and services. The impact of anti-corruption efforts, of course, these AML-CTF efforts should be seen as part of an overall anti-corruption and ethical governance approach from all stakeholders. Options to address the challenges: enhance self-regulation, incentivize compliance, an accreditation model through a recognized independent body, modernization and improved governance within NPOs, as well as improved outreach, capacity building for regulators and non-profits, especially rural and small NPOs or CBOs, community-based organizations. Options to address the challenges: need to address the persistent digital divide and an awareness of the risk of new digital vulnerabilities. So those who are joining the digital world need to be aware of when you join this an email service provider or set up a website, you need to be aware of online scams. You need to be made aware of artificial intelligence and what the significance is and the risks are of that for you as somebody who's perhaps a small organization, but you nevertheless face the same kind of sophisticated challenges that experienced, well-established NPOs face. And of course, that can affect you if you have a digital banking platform on your cell phone on behalf of an NPO. Those kind of risks need to be explained to the smaller, more vulnerable NPOs. So multi-stakeholder collaboration and sustained engagement seen as essential. Broad recognition of the challenges posed by applying international frameworks in South Africa as a developing country context. So key recommendations. DSD, update their database as a matter of urgency so that it can be interoperable with a network of regulatory databases. Regulatory dispensation for the NPO sector needs to be reviewed and streamlined so that all role players have clarity about their roles and all stakeholders have clarity about how the registration system operates. So if I'm an NPO, if I'm a CBO, if I'm a non-profit company, if I'm a trust, what does this all mean for me? Who do I report to? Do I need to maintain multiple accountabilities or will one or two suffice? The role of the NDA, they were really largely notable by their absence. Nobody referred to them as a stakeholder that had played any role in raising awareness, although that is part of their mandate. So there's a suggestion that their role needs to be investigated and a determination made as to whether its mandate is appropriately aligned with sectoral needs and whether it's appropriately structured and resourced to meet those needs. Government and the sector NPO sector should promote and incentivize self-regulation in the sector by establishing an independent statutory body to provide credibility through accreditation for NPOs that meet good governance standards. This can reduce the burden on government. It can help by assisting organizations to meet good governance standards, and can assist regulators to know this is a low-risk NPO because they've been accredited, they meet certain standards that have been set and are monitored by an independent statutory body. The NPO sector itself should revise its code of ethics to develop clear and succinct good governance guidance, possibly in the form of templates. As a complement to self-regulation, there's a need to continuously review and adapt regulatory requirements to meeting these evolving realities and needs, and to tailor the regulation according to the FATF requirements of proportionate, risk-based, targeted criteria, so that they are effective and sensitive to realities. To meet FATF guidelines, the funding regime and regulatory framework for the sector needs to be considered in conjunction with each other. Many NPOs indicated they're just unable to afford the costs of formalizing and registering themselves, which would help reduce risk, but it sometimes is unobtainable for them, including merely maintaining a bank account because of costs or because of the requirements that banks impose, but users aren't always aware of, that the bank account needs to be used on a regular basis. So banks need to be aware that they should not expect a bank account to be utilized on a regular basis, and be aware that there are legitimate reasons for that lack of regular use. And that's not necessarily a reason to therefore close an account and then unbank somebody. NPO sector, government, and other stakeholders should seek to facilitate partnerships for compliance, literacy, and capabilities using standardized templates with core content. Government and regulators need to enhance risk literacy, dedicated training programs. NPOs should be encouraged to review their records regularly for signs of suspicious activity. A big need for capacity building and awareness raising and training here. Whether or not it's just for ML or TF, or just for good governance reasons. NPOs need to be capacitated to draft and implement written policies. Again, proposal for standardized templates and core content, possibly developed by DSD in conjunction with this independent regulatory body for the non-profit sector. Banking status of NPOs should be investigated further. There needs to be engagement between sector representatives and banking sector representatives, so that there's greater understanding of mutual needs, risks, and compliance requirements. Government, whether through DSD or other entities, needs to communicate more clearly, extensively, and timeously. And thank you very much. I will stop there and hand over to the facilitator for the next part, Glenn Farid. Thank you. Sorry that this has taken longer than expected.
Thank you, Gary. Colleagues, are you able to hear me? I think if we were together, I'm seeing the applause, the thumbs up from everybody who's gathered here. I think the enormous amount of work that has been done, which we've tried to compress and share with you. Just to confirm, colleagues, as we've said in the chat, Suzanne, do you just want to share the update for everybody here, because I think there's a little bit of anxiety. Can I just give you the floor for a second? Suzanne or
Yes.
Fidel?
Oh, yeah.
So if you can, yes, I'm sorry, we are a little bit behind time, and I realize we provided quite a bit of content now. You know, I think Advocate Gary Pina went into a bit of depth, which was important. And often when you're playing these things, you know, it's never enough time when you're actually in the moment. So if I can ask, it looks like we might have to go over a little bit, probably by at least 15 minutes. And we don't want to rush the next panel discussion either, because we have quite a decent panel on the session. So if I could ask you, for those of you who can stay, if you can, please. And then we will proceed immediately so that there isn't any further delays. Just on the screen, you will see who our beautiful panelists are. Just very briefly, I'm going to say that Glenn Ferret is the moderator. I have already introduced him earlier on. So we'll jump straight to Ms. Lizay van Schoor. She is with the FIC, the Financial Intelligence Center. And then we've got Ms. Minnie Hendricks. So she is with the Tax Exempt Institution Segment Unit at the SARS, South African Revenue Services. And then we've got Mr. Luyanda Ngomyama. He is, of course, with DSD, the NPO Directorate. And then Mr. Jimmy Kotiana, you were introduced a few times this morning, or referenced to already, Jimmy. And Jimmy is with the NET, he's the national convener. We've got Mr. or rather Advocate Ricardo Weinhardt. He's an attorney, and he is working with South law, have been, you must all know Ricardo. And then we've got, of course, the convener or moderator, Glenn Ferret. I'm going to hand over to you so that I don't spend any time talking in your session. We look forward to listening to you.
Thank you, Ferial. Colleagues, as we go, I think it's important that we just locate ourselves for a minute. So the first thing I want to say to the team who did the research, to Inyatelo and everyone who has been associated with it, well done. I think the panelists are going to engage very robustly with your findings. It is 30 years since the Non-Profit Act was being developed and which would then be promulgated by 1997. This research now brings us up to date. It's a long journey that we've traveled towards regulation of nonprofits in South Africa, and it's an evolving framework which needs to keep pace with changes both locally and internationally, and the dynamics within the sector, and what we are learning from regulation, self-regulation, and the demands placed on nonprofits. I think, having said that, colleagues, I do want to say well done to everyone. I see Bernice is here, beyond the panel, Lillian and others who have helped to take South Africa off the grey list. So I think as a NPO sector, we seldom recognize, we are so focused on all our challenges, we don't pause to congratulate ourselves. So I want to say well done to everybody, Bernice, Suzanne, Ferial, and everyone else, Lillian, etc., who have, Anne, I see you there, Anne, thank you, who have helped move South Africa off the grey list and have enabled an informed conversation about regulation, not only in respect of anti-money laundering and terror finance, but I think the broader architecture in which we operate. So very, very well done to us as a sector. This panel now is I'm going to ask colleagues, given the constraints of time and the wide range of expertise you have, if you could share with us 2 key findings that you wish to engage on, and then maybe 2 or 3 ideas about where and how we should evolve these findings. I want to remind colleagues that this research is only a snapshot. It's ever evolving. It's continuously complex and engaging us to meet the challenges. So the panelists are very experienced and they have very specific insights that they'll be sharing, but it's for all of us to take the responsibility, as we have thus far, to represent nonprofits in the best possible way, but also to meet the regulatory requirements of our situation, to empower nonprofits and to enhance compliance with regulation. So I'm going to call on, I think, shall I start with you, Minnie?
Hi, Glenn.
Welcome.
I suppose
I was going to say welcome to Cape Town.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I'm not in Cape Town today, but it is a very big honor for SARS to share this platform today. And if I may just congratulate everyone again on this fantastic research. There are so few data points about the non-profit sector in South Africa. And as a regulator, we certainly look forward to engaging, learning, and taking the data points that we can from this very important research. So thank you very much for that. And Glenn, if you'll just allow me, you know my old refrain, the unintended consequence from my view on FATF has always been this wonderful cooperation that we now have, the increased research, the voices that we are hearing, and the way that we are interacting. And yes, maybe FATF was the catalyst that brought this together, but at the end of the day, we are doing this because it's best for the sector. It is best for how we operate. And there's nothing here that doesn't contribute to increased governance, to better regulation, to better engagement. So from that point of view, we always said that for us is the unintended consequence of FATF. Would you like me, Glenn, to give my key takeaway from this report?
Yes, please go ahead.
I've been through it very quickly. I think as SARS, we have certainly taken note of the low levels of financial literacy and the difficulty that the sector still has in engaging with tax matters. It's not new, but I think it's certainly good for us to have the data points and for it to be reiterated. I think then if I can just speak a bit more wider, the digital capacity and the report did highlight the lack of digital capacity in the sector. Not just, I think, in the sector, but I think overall how we as regulators engage with each other, how smaller organizations engage. And I do think that a lot of the issues that were raised and addressing a lot of the challenges can definitely be enhanced if we can increase the digital capacity of everyone concerned. And with that, I do mean everyone. It's not just other organizations. It is also certainly the capacity of regulators. What we can do when we have proper digital capacity is phenomenal. As SARS, you know that our mandate is primarily focusing on digitizing and making compliance better by using technology. But that also implies that we need to make sure that the recipients are adequately able to engage with this technology. So I think, I don't want to dwell on the findings, other than to say we've certainly taken note of the lack of tax understanding and what we need to do about that. But I would want for us as a grouping, because there's so few opportunities for us to get together like this, to brainstorm and to say, how can we just get over the digital capacity gap and these digital barriers that we have. Your reference to Kenya has been very welcome, and we will certainly be looking at what Kenya did right. And I think a lot of their enhanced self-regulation and regulation has been because of their ability to cross the digital divide. And the references to ethical leadership, strong governance, is something I think we all hold very dear. As government, we've seen, and as regulators, we've seen what it means when you lose your reputation and the reputational risk and how quickly things can go wrong. And I think equally for the non-profit sector or for civil society, your reputation is key. You hold us to account when everything else goes wrong. And you should jealously guard your reputation. And even if we just have one or two illicit or people who mess up the reputation, it's hard to claw back your reputation. As an institution that had some reputational damage done, we are very aware of how long and how furious we need to protect reputation. And therefore, I think whatever FATF has brought us, it's about protecting the reputation of the sector. It's about how we look after that which no one should be taking away from us. So as much as they are FATF-based regulations, they're very much aimed at good governance. There's nothing there that we don't know and that we shouldn't be doing. And I think that's it for me, Glenn. I'm aware of the time constraint. Carry on for quite a lot. So I can engage later again if you need anything from me. Thank you very much.
Thank
But
you.
again, well done. Very well done.
Thank you, colleagues. I do want to emphasize the point that Monet has made. I think she's been really being consistent about this throughout the processes which we've begun in relation to FATF, and that is that once we sit around the table and brainstorm solutions, we actually are stronger together. And I think that the confidence that this process has brought has really shown that collective strength is able to overcome the challenges. I now would like to ask Ricardo Wanga to come in with his reflections and key takeaways from the research and any further recommendations for action on the part of the regulators and or civil society actors. Ricardo, good day, welcome.
Thank you, Glenn. It's a privilege to be part of the panel discussion today. And I must just say that I echo completely what Monet was saying in terms of the collaboration, with the sector. And I agree that's part of the unintended consequences of the whole grey listing and FATF process. I also think we, as a country, it's quite a significant stage in which we are in. And I really do appreciate the fact that there's increased research in South Africa, specifically regarding the non-profit sector. There's been quite a gap, in the years prior to South Africa being grey listed on information regarding the non-profit sector. There's been some information, but clearly that the research has increased. And having looked at this particular or these findings, the research project, it's quite impressive in terms of the input and the recommendations, and even today's event, the fact that there's a cross section of the regulators and the non-profit sector participating. I think that's quite important. So in terms of the some of the unintended consequences, when I read the report, there was one word that sort of stands out for me, and that is balance or balanced approach or regulation. I think I actually did a search. It came up like 14 times in the report. And so consistently there was reference to the need to ensure that there is a balanced approach. And I think it's balanced in terms of a risk-based approach, because in the context where we are at the moment, and even with the bill that is out now for public comment, there are a couple of things that I think we need to balance in the context of non-profit organizations specifically. One of the key issues is especially the issue about the de-risking and balancing the commercial incentive. The reality is with non-profits, the commercial incentives are low. And that's not only in the South African context, but that's also broadly applicable in other countries, and research is increasingly emphasizing that. In fact, there was a study that was done in 2021, or published in 2021, involving multiple countries, but more focused in terms of the approach on banks, that banks have, in the context of non-profits. Clearly, it came out in this report as well in terms of that banking relationship. But for me, the emphasis is to ensure that there is a balanced approach, especially in terms of the risk-based narrative that's being advocated for. Now, so that's on the one level. Another level is in terms of security, and specifically talking about money laundering and terrorist financing, and then also weighing that up in terms of civil liberties. Clearly, look, there's been some disclaimers in the report, but clearly it also illustrates, given the small size of the respondents, even though it's a smaller size in terms of those that have been approached, and that's been clear or the disclaimer has been clearly communicated. What it points out to me that there's some vulnerability in terms of the non-profit sector, and clearly there are some targeting non-profit organizations for unlawful purposes. And the report made it clear that it doesn't give any indication as to what the approach of the sector was or those that have been approached, but clearly it illustrates a risk. And so it is not business as usual, but we do need to balance that in terms of what are the implications for non-profit organizations if the risks are unfairly or escalated. But clearly there's a risk, or there are risks in this context for non-profit organizations. The third aspect in terms of balancing this whole issue is in terms of all the sectors that are impacted in terms of grey listing and the FATF recommendations, there is a distinct category, especially in relation to non-profit organizations. And the report has indicated at the moment it's not, it's a negligible amount of organizations that have pointed this particular issue out. And that is the risk of recruitment of board members. So at the moment, it is not a key issue. But my concern is that, especially with the current proposals, that we may have a difficulty in future with board members signing up because of issues of risk in terms of exposure to liability, exposure to non-compliance. And it's especially in the context where non-profit board members ordinarily are not getting paid for their services. So it's a voluntary commitment. And in the context of increased regulation, one of my concerns is that we may find that non-profits in future, perhaps not now, but in future may find it more difficult to recruit board members. Because it seems to me, compared to the other industries, for those industries, there are incentives in terms of their businesses to continue and to ensure that there's compliance. In the context of non-profit organization, if you, as a potential board member, are faced with an administrative sanction with the implications of reputational damage, it's much easier just to say I'm not signing up. So I think we need to balance that and consider the approach. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Ricardo. A very balanced approach from Ricardo. But I think, Ricardo, we'll come back to you, and I think you can expand on some of those impacts that it may have to governance. So is there a potential, given the new amendments that are also before us now, in weakening governance if there are so many punitive measures in place, and thus reducing the number of qualified persons who may be willing? I'd like us to move on, is given that we're talking about de-risking and finding balance, to Lizay van Schoor from the Financial Intelligence Center. Lizay? Hi.
Can you hear
Hi,
me?
Glenn.
Oh, we couldn't hear you. I couldn't hear you. Are
I'm
you
sorry.
with us now? Oh, are
If
you
you can hear me,
unmuted? Well done.
if you can hear me and
Yes,
you
we
can see
can.
me, I'm with you. Thank you for the
Thank
opportunity, and I'm not going to repeat what some of my colleagues said. I'm very happy to be part of the process for a number of years now. And I do want to congratulate Inyatelo for the foresight to come up with a project of this nature in scope that's so broad, and the depth is really of such a nature that I think there's something for everyone. There's something for government, there's something for the regulators, there's something for the umbrella organizations and for NPOs themselves. So every time we take a pulse, we do a risk assessment, and we gather more information, I think we understand more of this complexity in terms of what we refer to as the unknown universe. But even though it's an unknown universe, I think the information that we have now at our disposal will enable us to do better in terms of policy development going forward. So I really want to thank you for the amount of effort that went into this research. I think there's a lot of knowledge available. There's a lot of recommendations that's practical that need to be unpacked further. I think context is very important, and the researchers were at pains to give that balance, to give that explanation that even though this is just a snapshot of a very small percentage of a known universe, this is what information that is coming to fore. And I think we do need to take cognizance of that in government as regulators and as policy developers and as legislators. So I think what is important, once this document gets published, it is going to be a perception piece that we will have to defend. There will be expectations. And the expectations, again, it's very balanced. There's roles, functions, and responsibilities for NPOs themselves, but also for government regulators and implementers in terms of all the very valuable recommendations that was made. I want to highlight 2 points. Principle for the Financial Intelligence Center, and risk is, of course, first point of departure. And I want to link that to the perception based on some of the findings in the document. So starting from the heading, our theme for this research, the scope of the FATF recommendation 8 for technical compliance is very narrow. The research went much broader than that, as you will all read, and I think none of this can be taken into in isolation. But of course, understanding risk, and for the purposes of the unintended consequences, we need to understand what does this involve for our very NPOs that do very valuable work in country, and for those that fall within the definition of at-risk non-profit organizations that could be exploited, limited to recommendation 8 for the purposes of terror financing. So I do appreciate all the information that went into that, and we were at pains to also explain the broader implications for the period that we were under during assessment, the mutual evaluation, the grey listing that followed. Of course, none of this happened in isolation. So I think my final word, before I come to a couple of positive comments, is it's a very valuable piece of information. A lot of recommendations can be translated and must be translated into practical recommendations for implementation. What's next? Some of the respondents already commented on the next round for the General Laws Amendment Bill that's out. There's some amendments in the NPO Act that I'm sure some of my colleagues will speak to just now. There's still time until the 13th of February to respond to that on the website of National Treasury when that GLLA 2025 was published. In our next round of preparations for the mutual evaluation in April of 2027, we're already underway. And I think it's incumbent on all of us, be it contributors, reviewers, or just readers of this document, to get the message out. I want to say 1 or 2 things more positive, and I do take the comments addressed to the banking industry as a whole very serious, our engagement with the Banking Association. But I also want to highlight the good work that is currently already underway in a public-private partnership with the South African Anti-Money Laundering Integrated Task Force on this very topic of access to bank banking for NPOs and the avoidance or mitigation of the unintended consequences of de-risking. We do need to get that information. We need to get it from our banking partners. That's part of that public-private partnership. I hope to see that information also published in the near future, because in the next round of evaluations for the Financial Action Task Force, that will be the 5th round, we need to demonstrate through effectiveness that as a country, we can show that there is not creep in terms of our regulatory framework, our legislative framework, and that de-risking, when it does happen, is not with the unintended consequences, as I think was very well explained by Gary in the report as well, to drive NPOs further underground. We do want to have all our NPOs as part of our framework, and we need to look at creative and I think sometimes out of the box ways to think of how to include it. I'll stop at that and let other colleagues also comment. Thank you so much for the opportunity again.
Thank you, Lizzie. I think, colleagues, as always, a fountain of information and excellent comments from the FIC. I think there is information from SAMLIT, which is the Anti-Money Laundering Integrated Task Team. I think these questions of the mutual, how we contribute to the GLAA amendments is something that falls squarely in the responsibility of NPOs and sector organizations to contribute. And I think the collective point about ensuring that there is not a creep in respect of de-risk heritage, as well as our collective contribution to the next round of the mutual evaluation report. So this is an ongoing and not a completed piece of work that is before us. So thank you to Lizzie for those comments. I now have the privilege of handing over to the big boss of us all, Mr. Ngonyama. You have the floor.
Good morning, colleagues. I would like to start by welcoming the research, particularly the hard work done by our researchers. Obviously, this research report comes at a correct time when, as the NPO Directorate, we are working with the sector to finalize the NPO policy, which many of you know that the current NPO Act does not have a policy. So that therefore means for us as the department, together with the NPO technical team, we'll have to look at some of the recommendations that are proposed here and ensure that we fine-tune them and include them into the draft policy. But the take home for me, it's actually three things coming out of this research. Is that we need to strengthen collaboration amongst us as regulators. That's the work that we have already started to do. But the only thing then that we need to do is to enhance that and strengthen it, so that at least there are no unintended consequences, you know, of all the things that we are doing as the regulators to the NPOs. But secondly, to ensure that we strengthen collaboration between government and the sector. I'm glad as the department, again, we have started to work very closely with the NPO sector, so that at least at the end of the day, we remove, you know, the mistrust that has existed between government and the sector. Lastly, on this part, I think what we need to do as the sector, when I'm saying as the sector, I mean us as government and the NPO sector, is to develop a platform where we can discuss these MLTF related issues, to ensure that before we move and draft either legislation, regulations, programs, we would have shared some common interest, but also we would have identified what are the key challenges that we want to address with these interventions, to avoid a reactionary approach where things are done and then at the time of post implementation, we only start looking at, then we identify gaps. Obviously, there will be some gaps, but at least we can avoid some of the gaps that are identified. Lastly, I think it is important for us to understand that the second amendment of the NPO Act that are published through the General Laws Amendment Act seek to close the gaps that were identified in the earlier amendments, but also to strengthen monitoring, because some of the things that are mentioned or interventions that are mentioned in the current amendments seek to strengthen that. But however, I want to call upon the sector to make submissions where you feel that we might have gone overboard, and also come up with suggestions in terms of how we should mitigate that. But most importantly for me, I'm looking forward to work with the sector at an early stage, actually, when we prepare the regulations now for the implementation of these amendments. I think there is an opportunity for us as the sector to work together to ensure that we mitigate against, the unintended consequences of money laundering and terror financing. Thanks.
Thank you, Leander. I think the challenge is well received, colleagues. I'm going to move now, if I can ask Mr. Gotiana, and this will be our final panelist presentation before we open for Q&A. From the Alliance of NPO Networks of South Africa. Jimmy? I just checked, is Mr. Kotiana here with us? To the technical team?
He's here. He's just turned on his camera and his mic.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Thanks.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Glenn?
Yes, you can go. Please go ahead, Jimmy.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon, Glenn. Indeed, I must say that we are very much happy. Myself, Jimmy Kochana, as well as Cynthia Kushimba, both from the Alliance of NPO Networks, as well as Unmute Civil Society in South Africa. We are both a national representative structure for the NPOs in the country. That we are given an opportunity to participate in this process. And we would like to commend Inyatelo for taking it upon themselves to ensure that we fully participate in this, research, program. And I think we are saying this because I think in our discussion earlier, we were of the view that without the vocal inputs coming up from ordinary NPOs, I don't think we can say that this research report will, encapsulate the views of those NPOs. So we're happy that in all the 9 provinces in our country, we were involved through a focus group a discussion where we allowed at least not more than 25 organizations in each province with a set of questions, wherein they will deliberate amongst themselves so that we could come up, with clear recommendation, which were well articulated by, I think, Advocate Gary Pinar. I think my key takeaway from this process is that, first of all, this study targeted registered NPOs, and it allowed participation of the sector from rural, from the township. It involves the disabled and vulnerable groups. It enhances, active participation from the NPOs in our respective provinces, so that we know what issues, will emanate from that process. And I must say that I think Inyatele, to some extent, made great strides, because I think we need to ensure that in future there should be, an outreach, not only an outreach, but I think let's ensure that, we publicly inform the NPOs, so that they could own the process. Because this research process, at the end of the day, it should be owned by the ordinary citizens, the NPOs themselves. So it therefore means that the raising of awareness amongst the country's civil society organization through production as well as dissemination of information, I think, is paramount. So without that, I think it will defeat the whole purpose. I think the common concern which came across the sector was a lack of capacity. And I think our researchers, to some extent, they've covered that to illustrate that there was indeed a clear support required for NPOs nationwide. And secondly, I think the issue of unfavorable banking systems, as well as a lack of public awareness on programs about the FATF recommendation, I think were some of the issues that came out. So we hope that at least in the next process, involvement and participation of the private sector, in particular the banking sector, is something that will be looked at. Because I think as NPOs, we are of the view that the private sector, business sector, they play a critical role in the country, as they are one of the critical stakeholders within the political landscape. The other issue that we wanted to make mention was the issue of a clear role of NDA. Looking at their mandate is something that we need to look at it, because I think even though they fall within the ambit of the Department of Social Development, but I think it's important that the agenda is driven along the lines of being pro the NPO space in South Africa. So finally, we are of the view that the organizations that have received information will ensure that they disseminate this information, will ensure that the rural communities, people from the urban, peri-urban areas, organizations, the NPOs, we look into this, will ensure that there's an alignment of FATF recommendation, which are key elements of the NPO policy. We will look into the issue of the risk assessment and mitigation, transparency and accountability, as well as the legislative review. So all in all, Glenn, the chairperson, I think we are happy with the report, and we commend the active participation of the researchers in ensuring that they produce this living document. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gotiana. I think those are insightful comments, as always, colleagues. I can see in the chat that information is being shared. So just to reiterate this, Suzanne, you can please confirm. Immediately after this webinar, colleagues, you will be receiving the report as well as the recording. So for anybody who feels that they may be missing parts of the conversation due to bad network or anything like that, or that you have not fully followed some of the contributions, the recording will be shared immediately after. Also, just to note that Gary Advocate Pinar has shared on there the notice regarding the MPO, the GLAA amendments. And they do require some engagement, colleagues, because I think, yeah, there are some challenges there that the sector needs to speak to. I'm going to, at this point, please invite you all by a show of hands, and I'm going to ask the back-end colleagues from Inyatelo to assist in opening the floor to you to comment and respond. And then I do want to save some time for the researchers to come back into the conversation, if that's okay with everybody. They are also monitoring your chat, so please feel free to use that space as well. Could we just follow the normal protocol, colleagues, of raising your hand on the chat, and then the team will unmute you to speak, I think, if I understand it correctly. I know Vanessa and who else has been active in the chats, colleagues? Nigel, Jenny. Hi, Jenny. Okay. Hilda, please go ahead. Can we unmute Hilda if they need to be unmuted?
Hi, Glenn. Hilda will have to unmute herself.
Hilda, can you unmute yourself?
Hi, Glenn. That is my colleague, Yona. Yona, kindly unmute the one using the login.
Okay. Hi.
All right.
How
Let
are
me
you?
just text him. Yeah. Thank you very much for the report.
Are you hearing me now?
Yes, you can hear you now.
Great. Hi, Glenn. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
The researchers. Thank you for
Colleagues,
the great.
you're sneaking in. Please introduce yourselves quickly.
Thank you, Glenn, for the guidance. My name is Yona Wanjala. I work for the Civic Advisory Hub, which is the policy research, capacity building, and advocacy organization working on the African continent in areas related to transnational organized crime and their nexus to civic space. I found the engagement and the research very informative, so insightful. But key aspects I wanted to have as my takeaway, thank you to the regulators. I'd like to highlight one of the aspects at the point when I properly had, in line with the reception of the internet, the regulator of the NGO, who proposed a platform to continue the conversation on ML CFT related aspects with the NGO sector to inform policy guidance, policy reform. We strongly, as the Civic Advisory Hub, support this, and this is one of the things we encourage across the continent, creating dialogue spaces for civil society and the regulators. We've launched this in over 5 countries across the continent, Zimbabwe, Uganda, Kenya, and others. And they really, really build trust, because when you talk about money laundering and terrorism financing and the unintended consequence, some of these topics raise mistrust and suspicion. And sometimes the mistrust and suspicion is bred by ignorance on the topic. So this platform to continue the conversation, bridge the knowledge gap, cultivate trust, but also create informed reforms. Thank you. I just wanted to highlight that, and we are happy to join hands with Inyatelo, one, to publicize the content, but also to work together, supporting each other on how to create this platform. Over to you, Glenn. Thank you.
Thank you, Yona. And Paula, please, colleagues, could you, if you can, use the chat, and if there's any link for colleagues to pick up from, please, could you just place it there for us? And we will share your details further, if that's okay with you, as an outcome of this meeting. Is that okay, Yona, Paula? Colleagues, are we together? Suzanne?
Yes, we are. Yes, we're still here.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Um,
Are there other hands that we can call on? Other speakers, contributors from the participants?
Not at this moment. No hands at this moment.
Does that mean we've exhausted you, non-profit organizations? Go
Glenn,
ahead,
I think
Vanessa.
we've got Vanessa's hand up.
Vanessa, you will never disappoint me. Go ahead.
Well, I was trying to be a bit circumspect and put my comments and questions in the chat box so I don't chew everyone's ear off as usual. So I've got nothing more to say other than the things that I put in the chat. So I don't know if you want me to read them or ask them.
If you could summarize, because I think they are actionable points that need to be taken forward. I think to the question that has been posed, there is an MPO task team which exists, and I can ask any of the participants in that to speak to that. There was your one question, I think, Vanessa, and I think there's also one that's focused on recommendation 8. But go ahead with your other comments.
Okay, well, the one that I'm most interested in, actually, I mean, obviously I'm interested in it all, and I think that the other two will be addressed. But it came up when we were doing the research, because I participated on behalf of our grassroots organization. Is has there been any definition of what a terrorist is? Do we use a government definition? Because there was a lot of, people who aren't terrorists get called terrorists, people who are terrorists don't get called terrorists. Have they defined, and some people think a certain group is a terrorist organization and other people will think that they are a liberation organization. So has that been defined in any way? Thanks.
Okay. I'm going to throw this open to either the research team or any of the panelists who might want to speak to this. How do we know who is a terrorist and what definition is used and how is it applied and by whom? There's something from Lizzie there. Lizzie, can I ask you to come in?
Yes, thank you. This is a question that I think will for always be with us. There's no definitive universal definition. So the South African definition of a terrorist activity is contained in the Poctatara Act. That's our counterterrorism legislation. But I just posted the full act is called the Protection of Constitutional Democracy Against Terrorist and Related Activities Act. It was also revised and updated as part of the previous round of amendments to also broaden and review some of the aspects, but you'll find a reference in the definition section on the terrorist activity in our primary legislation section. But please have a read through the attached sectoral risk assessment on non-profits organizations that we've conducted and published in February of 2024. It's in the chat box that Bernice Besset coordinated for us supported by the EU Global Facility. I think that's some valuable reading. But this can be a debate that can last very long, but that's a quick answer. And of course, you're most welcome to contact us for further information. There's actually quite a lot of work that went into this. There's a June 2022 Terror Financing National Risk Assessment that was published. I'll point that out to you as well as drop it in the text, as well as a more recent one on June 2024. But I'll stop there. Otherwise, I'll take too much of your valuable time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lizzie. I think, Gary, you wanted to come in quickly on this thorny question. Can I just call on you again? So, colleagues, there's this Prevention of Crime, Organized Crime Act, which has been on the statute for a very long time now. So it is what should guide us at a national level. There are also United Nations instruments, but Gary, can you assist on this question?
Glenn, thanks. This is a bit of sort of my general knowledge rather than a reference to the Act itself. So I would encourage colleagues in the meeting to follow Lisa van Schoor's advice to look at the publication and the Paktatara Act. But terrorism is normally defined as the use or threat of force or intimidation with a political objective. That word political is a very loaded concept. So I think that introduces an element of uncertainty into what terrorism is and why it's applied and misapplied in different situations. So I think, and the issue with terror financing is whether or not it promotes that in some way. The example that we haven't used in the report, but that was repeatedly given to us, for example, is if an organization sends money out of the country, let's say to northern Mozambique, to an organization working there, in the communities there, and the purpose of that money is to drill boreholes for people, let's say, for example, or something like that. The fact that that area is subject to a terrorist insurgency by ISIS-related organizations, does that make that financing? Is it supporting terror? Is it financing terror? And so the link between those two different sets of activities is the other big gray area. And so how that is defined, how that link is established, how that support is identified, I think is an area of great concern. Because there can be two ostensibly unrelated activities that might be related purely by the coincidence of the location of some of that activity. So I think that's just that's one of the gray areas that I think that we've become aware of, but we haven't sought to define this in the report, and I think that might have been an oversight. Sorry. Thanks.
Thank you, Gary. Given the exhaustive nature of your report, I think everybody here will forgive you for not having unpacked that thorny question of what is and when is an action, a terrorist action. Thank you, Lizzie, for sharing a number of resources, colleagues there that will assist you on this. To the rest of us here gathered, colleagues, there were a number of questions raised about
if I can interrupt you, Glenn. We had
Yes.
Yona had his hand up. I think you may want to comment.
Yona, please come in again. Paula, Yona.
Hello, Glenn. Thank you. Yona again from the Civic Advisory Hub. Are you able to hear me? Yes. I just wanted to get an understanding of what the legislations in South Africa reflect when it comes to beneficial ownership. It's one of the misapplied concepts in many jurisdictions. For example, do NGOs have beneficial ownership? How do we classify beneficial owners of NGOs that are coalitions? Do we put it onto the secretariat management? Do we classify all the members who constitute the General Assembly as beneficial ownership? Kindly guide on these researchers. Over to you, Glenn.
Thank you. And not just the researchers, I think we have experts on beneficial ownership here. Bernice, I hope you haven't left us. Ricardo.
No, I haven't
Bernice?
left you. I haven't left you, but I wouldn't call myself a beneficial ownership expert, more on the NPO side. I'm not sure if Lisa will be more tuned to the beneficial ownership updated information. I know that has changed quite a bit in the last while. I think she unmuted, so she might have something to add value to.
Yes, thank you. Again, I'll be very brief because this is actually probably worth a whole webinar on its own. But thank you for the question. South Africa recently amended with the previous round of our General Laws Amendment Act implemented two types of registries for companies and for trusts. They are overseen by regulators for our Companies and Intellectual Property Commission, SIPC, in the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, and the Master of the High Court for Trusts, that's in our Justice Department. So the requirement for registration of beneficial ownership of directors will, to my knowledge, and I think this deserves a proper legal review, apply to those instances of directors that's also registered as companies or trusts or NPOs. With the various regulators. In the case of NPOs, we add then the South African Revenue Service for not-for-benefit companies. Manay can come in here, and then for NPOs, the Department of Social Development. So we have a multifunctional regulatory system. As government, we do not refer to it as fragmented. We refer to it as multi-layered. And it really depends on the activities of the director and the requirements why such a director need to be registered. But I see Manay's hand is up. So Manay, please correct me if I provide any incorrect information.
No, absolutely not. Thank you, Glenn. I think we all just want to assist each other, yeah, because I do think we should have a session on beneficial ownership. But in simple terms, beneficial ownership interpreted is those individuals who have direct or indirect influence over the affairs of an organization and can direct the funding or the activities. From a SARS point of view, and I think not to speak for DSD, but you already have to declare who the people are that are involved in the affairs of the organization. So even if you're a voluntary association, you need to inform us who the elected members are, or the public representatives. And I don't think this is over-regulation. This is just good governance. People should know who are involved in the affairs of non-profit organizations or any organization for that matter. But especially for those organizations from a SARS point of view who profess to be in the interest of the public and who are there for public benefit, it's important that we know who these people are. So our forms, we do share information with SIPC, the Master of the High Court. We'll also have beneficial ownership when a lot of the SARS requirements now include beneficial ownership when it comes to completing returns and also when it comes to completing applications. So it does add a little bit of complexity, but I think it's all part of good governance, and we have to remind ourselves that South Africa is not doing anything that other countries are not doing. And I heard earlier reference to say that some international directors are finding it more difficult to engage in South Africa. I do think we need to be cautious about that because nothing that we are requiring in South Africa is not international best practice. And they would have similar requirements in other countries and other jurisdictions. I think we just need to ensure that we implement it in a way that is equitable and that crosses the digital divide. And, you know, we often do speak, as Liz said, of the complex regulation. I think we need to remind ourselves that it's an ecosystem of regulation. It is not that we regulate a tax mandate, SIPC regulates a company mandate, DSD regulates another mandate. That we have to coordinate and integrate is absolutely essential. And therefore, if you do beneficial ownership with one, we should be able to share that information. We should be able to make that information available to each other. And that is something we need to look at. So I don't think I answered the question 100%, Glenn, but I think it's a challenge to us. Maybe this year let us try and have a beneficial ownership discussion and see how we can enrich that discussion. But it does apply to the nonprofit sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. Colleagues, so we have a description of a multi-layered integrated ecosystem, which is a good way of describing it. But I want to ask Gary to come in, and then Ricardo and anyone else who wishes to speak, not just on this point. I think we agree, I think, feel that some of these pieces of work need further exploration.
Thank you, Glenn. I'll try to be brief. The explanations that we obtained through the interviews regarding especially foreign directors compared to South African-based directors of South African NPOs, the differences are quite substantial and quite onerous for various reasons. But primarily it comes down, in my understanding, and I'm subject to correction, that in South Africa, for example, when one is asked to provide a certified copy of your identity and proof of your address, one can simply go to a local police station and without charge and without formality, just get a certified copy, certified by the police officer at the counter in the police station. In other jurisdictions, the requirements are far more onerous, and they require certification by a commissioner of oaths or equivalent, and that will often cost money. So and that would be, in dollars and euros, it amounts to several thousand rand in the examples that we were given. So especially if a local NPO is asking its directors to volunteer, but then asking them to undertake these kinds of costs, and appointments have to be made, in my experience, sometimes months in advance, to get an appointment with that commissioner of oaths, to get the certified copy. Time and cost really are significant factors that then delay the compliance by the local NPO. So yeah, I'll leave it at that and open to correction by others who might be more directly involved and have direct experience, but that's mine.
I'm not sure, Anne or anyone else who wants to build on the point that is being made by Gary. So I think to our colleagues here, I think the contention is not that it is impossible, but that it does seem to have some practical implication in respect of foreign or those who are outside of South Africa's jurisdiction, that it might not be as easy as it is in South Africa or for people residing in South Africa. Could I ask, are there further comments on this point or additional points, colleagues? I'm interested also from the NPO sector if there are comments on self-regulation and codes of conduct in your thinking or in your contributions.
Sorry, Glenn, it's
Yes,
Ricardo here. was struggling to raise my virtual hand. Maybe just to echo on the issue of beneficial ownership, I agree with that essentially it comes down to non-profits. The definition is wide enough to include non-profit organizations. In terms of the NPO Act, the phrase that is being used there is the control structure, and essentially that's what it comes down to also. At least in my understanding, in terms of even with the Trust Property Control Act and the Companies Act. Maybe just a comment on the issue of international board members. One of the things that I found is that if you set up a company or an organization with international board members, South African legislation is fairly flexible, even in the context of the changes that took place in 2023. So you can set up or incorporate the company. However, it becomes very difficult to open a bank account in that context when directors or the initial directors are outside of South Africa. I've had a situation, just as an example of a client that got incorporated in 2023. They haven't been able to open a bank account. In fact, they've asked me to assist in terms of approaching the bank. You can't get a straight answer. And I think it's not deliberate in terms of not wanting to open a bank account, but as I mentioned earlier about the risk, the banks are weighing up the risk in terms of the potential of a fine as opposed to just saying no to a company with international directors. So that's a real risk, and it's frustrating. And sometimes I hear this kind of criticism from clients in terms of what's happening, and it is true that it's not unique to South Africa. So criticism that's directed against South Africa is also not fair, but it is a reality at least in terms of the experience I had with my clients in terms of opening a bank account in that context, which has got then further implications because it becomes a bit of a challenge to embark on the further steps if you don't have a bank account. So thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, colleagues. But I think, again, the question that comes to mind, dear colleagues, is the extent to which there is an effective and quick touch point for stakeholders to be able to engage. And I think that remains an elusive, while there is greater collaboration and more forums, the extent to which the private sector, I think, Jimmy, you raised this question and others have as well, particularly with the banks, how do we expedite engagement and communication between ourselves? And does this also, again, reinforce the absence of a national coordinating mechanism? And again, the question of self-regulation amongst NPOs. So while there is a challenge, the solutions also seem to lie within the sector being able to articulate itself and then to be able to take evidence to an effective problem-solving forum where the extent of the problem can be determined, but also guidelines and protocols can be strengthened. I'm going to allow, with Ferial's permission, I'm going to ask from the panelists if there are any further contributions, and then to give Gary and his team 5 minutes, if not. Luyanda, Ricardo, Jose, Mane, Jimmy, can I call on you in any order to just give you any closing remarks, and then we'll hand over. Luyanda first. Thank you.
So just a quick one on the couple of things that we have raised, particularly on the self-regulation and coordination. I made reference to some of these things that are already embedded or included into the draft NPO policy. So there is a reference, there's even a model that is being proposed there that will allow, non-profit organizations to participate in various networking structures of their choice. So that's taken care of in that sense, because there is an agreement amongst us that the days of having one national coordinating structure are over. We need to allow people, based on the benefits and interest, to belong to a networking structure that will better service them. The second part then, it's what happens next, in terms of creating a platform. I'm sure you are already aware that there is a structure that DSD is trying to put together to look at the MLTF, benchmarking and best practice. So what we might have to do at some stage is to look at that and say, in the interest of these findings and recommendations, what is the role of this structure? What role can it coordinate? Because it includes both civil society and the Department of Social Development. But of course, then amongst government departments, that is DSD, NPO Directorate, SARS, CIPC, and MASTER, there is a structure again that exists there. So we might have to look at that. Then we say, maybe as a coordinated body, that structure needs also to participate in this structure that we are talking about, so that at least there is some speaking with one voice in some of the things, in order to avoid repeating the same things, but also a sense of cohesion and working together with the sector. Thanks.
Thank you, Leander.
Yeah.
Colleagues?
Yeah.
Jimmy?
Glenn. Yeah, look, Glenn, I think on the issue of building trust, I think Luyanda is correct. I think strides are there. I think is vividly open that the sector and government, I think we're coming closer to each other without doubts in trying to address the perception of the lack of genuine partnership. So I think we're happy in that regard. But I think, moreover, on the issue of strengthening the NPO capabilities, I think we're still calling upon for the regulators, in particular DSD, to come to our salvation, to assist in strengthening the NPO capabilities, particularly those smaller organizations that you'll find in the rural areas. Because I think there are still struggles to comply with general financial laws governing the sector. And I'm saying this because I think they've raised it to us that they can access specialized, auditing skills, so that they could improve their financial accountability. So organizations like CIBA, yes, they are available, but I think we need to expand more so that we ensure that we reach out to our rural folks, so that we strengthen their, financial, accountability. So those are the areas that I think we need to ensure that we look into them going forward. It's not only for DSD, but I think other regulators, as long as there's a willingness from their side to work in partnership to strengthen the NPO capacity, because capacity building, I think, is something that we need to look at it. If we want to adhere, if we want the NPOs to adhere to the AFATAF recommendation. Yeah, thank you, Glenn.
Thanks. Ricardo?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for Jimmy's input. Just I think the collaboration that Jimmy referred to with SIBA, it's an excellent example of collaboration, and I think for me that's the key word. Again, being reinforced in terms of this engagement. The reality is that we don't want to go back onto the grey list. It's in nobody's interest. And so it's imperative on us to collaborate and hold hands. Thank you.
Ricardo, Monet, and then Lizzie.
Thank you so much. And I just want to thank Inyatela and the researchers again for this wonderful piece of work. It's going to become a very important data point, not just for us as individual regulators, but for South Africa as a whole, as we proceed. And then I think, can we maybe start focusing on what the next steps are? And we talk about capacity building, we talk about the banking sector that needs to assist. But, unless we are specific about what is needed in terms of capacity building and what is needed to assist, it will just become a hollow cry. So maybe through Inyatelo, Jimmy, through the civil society structures, I'd like to urge you to begin to be a little bit more constructive or pertinent about what it is that you need, so that we don't anticipate your needs and we miss the mark again. But thank you. This is really a wonderful data point for all of us going forward. And thank you again.
Thank you.
From my side, I would just like to thank everyone. It's not the end of a process. I really see it as a ongoing journey. It is a swiftly moving landscape that we are dealing with. I'm not aware of many countries who've done similar research, if at all. So this would really stand us in good stead in our country preparation for the next round of the mutual evaluation. And for anyone and everyone on this call that stayed this long, I think this is a testament of how important we see this work. And we would like to support you in any way to get the message out. And please call upon us for future engagements or to bring the right experts to explain whatever need to be unpacked further.
Thank you, Liz. Colleagues, there's a massive tension, and there always has been in our regulatory environment. On the one hand, given our constitutional framework, the state has a positive duty to create an enabling environment for civil society in general and nonprofits in particular. On the other hand, we have a constant need to generate a regulatory framework within which compliance is monitored and measured and enforced. Between those two things, we can say that we are better off than many jurisdictions, but hard work remains before us. And I think most importantly, where we are identifying gaps, they are also opportunities. So the challenge to help collectively identify strategies that close the digital capabilities between NPOs and the regulators. Challenges with the banking sector and specific capacity building interventions which meet the needs of high at-risk organizations, but also NPOs in general. I want us to remember, colleagues, that our legislative environment is not merely regulation and compliance enforcement. It is generating an enabling environment for nonprofits, which is the work that Inyatelo, amongst others, has pioneered as a joint co-responsibility between the sector and the regulators. So, and in that, and when I say the sector, I include the funders and the private sector who contribute to development in our country. That's the last word from me, Firial. I hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, everyone. I don't want to apologize, but I should. It's been, we're about an hour over the planned time, but as Lizzie said, appreciate those who stayed the course, because I think it was important also for you to listen and understand what's gone into gathering, get to the point of the findings. So what has been the core evidence that leads now to the findings? So thank you for staying. I really appreciate that. And when I was thinking about this as everybody was engaging with each other, in South Africa, the timing for this research, the launch of this research is so impeccable. I mean, we're looking at so we're now in January 2026, and South Africa officially exited the FATF grey list. It was in October 2025, right? However, the hard work isn't over, right? Just because we came off the grey list doesn't mean we now fold our hands. As all of us have said, and we've even listened and heard some comments from other individuals from the Civic Advisory Hub. Yona, thank you very much. Thank you. Yona's great. He always shows up. He's always there. We try and attend his sessions as well, so it's been great. And then, so I also just want to reiterate Lizette's earlier comment about there is something for everyone when she did her opening talk in the panel discussion. There's something for everyone. I must totally agree with you. I was reminded that the National Treasury has made it clear that delisting is not the finish line. And so South Africa is now in what I think a sustainable phase, which is one of the things we're doing here is preparing for the next full mutual evaluation, which is this year, sometime in 2026. And so I do think that the recommendations from this research should play a direct or critical role in ensuring that South Africa doesn't just stay off this grey list, but we do so without crushing the NPO sector. That is the reason why we're here. That is the reason why we're all pooling together our energy, our efforts. As we do not want to get into the position where we feel totally, crushed by all this that is that's happening around us. And so I do also just in the little bit of time that allows, want to draw a few links to what came out of the research. And I'm thinking of a couple of us have mentioned the General Laws Amendment Bill 2025 that is coming up now for public comment. And I saw in the chat that there was information posted on this. So I do encourage you to read. The members of the NPO working group have already kind of put our heads around. We need to put more effort into it, by the way, and you will hear from us in the next couple of days, because the submission definitely needs to be made. Whether we will make, that's up to the members when we do get together. And so in terms of that, the findings so the research to the link on that topic, the findings can definitely serve as a sort of formal submission to Treasury. I'm making a big statement here, right? But this will, I think, provide the evidence needed to ensure that the new monitoring and enforcement powers currently given to the NPO director are proportionate. Okay, and I won't say any more on that, but I just want to encourage us to think about that. And then secondly, on refining the risk-based approach, there's a major concern for South Africa's grey listing that it was a failure. Oh, my battery's running low. Let me just quickly hit the cable. Yeah, so there was so a major reason for South Africa's grey listing was a failure to demonstrate a risk-based understanding of the NPO sector. I mean, many of us agree to that. And so in response, there is a view that government has been aggressive in its oversight. And so how do we link to the research? So this report could provide the nuance that the FIC needs. It can help shift government's focus away from the blanket monitoring of all of the 200,000 plus registered NPOs. And perhaps we should approach it towards a more targeting focus. Well, not perhaps we should approach towards a more targeted focus on only those few that meet the factor technical definition of being at risk in inverted commas. And the third point I want to make around ending banking, we've spoken about de-risking, and we know there's a lot more to be spoken, and we need to convene around this more aggressively as a sector. Despite the de-listing, many organizations, many South African NPOs will struggle with, and you might be familiar with the campaign, Know Your Customer, hurdles at the major banks. So Standard Bank, FNB, and Nedbank have often maintained high barriers. I think most banks do this, but from our understanding, these high barriers are in place because obviously banks fear the Prudential Authority fines that could be slapped on them. And so, I mean, incidentally, the first few reference group meetings, I was thinking of how do we get the, I think there was a comment made by bringing business and banks, etc., back into the room. So we had Nedbank at the first 1 or 2 reference group meetings for this research project. And with the change of when people leave the organization, you know, they were passionate about it, brought it into the fold of their work. When they leave and new people join, unfortunately, we didn't manage to get the interest of other individuals working at and I'm saying Nedbank specifically, they were the only bank who responded and came in. So then in preparing for this 2026 mutual evaluation, I think FATF will probably come back in mid-26. I'm sure Lizzie Monet would be able to give us more dates. And so one of the new priorities is mitigating unintended consequences. We read up about that. And so how then does this research link into that? So we think that, you know, if they pay attention to some of the recommendations that is being made now, we can certainly show that FATF, that South Africa is a legal, is a global leader in compliance. So South Africa is a global leader in compliance. So we've got the research now. How do we just pull out pieces so that we don't reinvent the wheel and make sure that we demonstrate that South Africa is on the cutting edge of things, we're moving ahead, we've listened, we're hearing people, and we need to do a little bit more to get the ball rolling so that we stay off the grey list entirely. And so the last thing I want to say is to thank everyone from the bottom of my heart. There's a whole list of people that I want to thank. So if you can quickly, please give me a moment to thank them. Members of the working group, the NPO working group, have been really supportive over the last few years. We established the NPO working group in 2021. We're still going very well with members, of course, who have the time, and we recognize that. And then the reference group members, there's a whole list of reference group members who participated over the course of the research. Some came, others, you know, stayed a bit longer than others. We really, really appreciate quite a few of you are here today. The Ford Foundation, who showed a very keen interest in listening to what we have to say back in June 2023. And by the end of that year, I think they were much warmer to the idea that we have put on the table. I do want to say that Glenn was quite integral as well in helping us to prepare that proposal at the time. We've also been very privileged to work with and engage with Dr. Jean Nel and Professor Louis de Coker. They're both based in Australia. We were very privileged to work with Sangeeta Goswami and Leah Brookerman. Both of them are based in the Netherlands, working under the Global NPO Coalition, as well as the organization that they're connected to, which is the Human Security Collective. And I want to say a big thank you to the researchers. They've been exceptionally patient. I mean, you know, you heard Michael say the small number of responses that he eventually got out of thousands, hundreds of thousands of emails that went out. So the fact that they stayed on and didn't get frustrated and say, well, you know, this is not going to be credible. They didn't. They courage and they stayed the course. So thank you to the researchers. Really, really, really appreciate you. Finally, the Inyatelo team have been committed. The teams in most organizations are getting smaller and smaller, and so too has Inyatelo over the time. But we've got a group of very committed individuals who are like everybody else in the nonprofit sector. You know, they multitask and they triple hat and all sorts of things. And so I really appreciate them tremendously. But I also want to say a special word of thanks to Suzanne Solomons, who I would say her steady hand and dedication truly held many moving pieces together of this project over the little while. And you know, again, as I say, the whole team has been fantastic. We are very privileged and appreciate the fact that we've been able to hold it and lead on this but we could never have done this with all of you. So I really, really appreciate it. Thank you. And Glenn already did part of my closeout by saying the report's going to be available. We're going to send you a summary of this. Watch out. We're going to probably do a couple of media releases over the next few days. Tag us, like us on social media, if you don't mind. I think all of us can make this bigger than what it is at the moment. So thank you very much. There was a couple of hands up. Glenn said thumbs up. Anybody else want to say a last word before we close out? Totally, we're done. Hard stop. Suzanne. Suzanne, your hands up.
Oh, no, I was just applauding. I was just clapping.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
you
you.
for your time. Go well and be safe.
Thank you, colleagues.
Pleasure. Bye.
Thank you, colleagues. Bye-bye.
Bye.